Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, wherever you are in the world. We're so happy to have you all here with our good friend Arpit over at Databeats, the founder and data extraordinaire, I have to say. So we are so happy to have you here today and really dig into a super hot topic in the market right now, which is data quality. Why everyone needs to care about things you can't ignore, all of the goodness that is how to give you better data quality to power everything you're doing with that data, right? So let's jump right into it and kind of get started here. So please feel free, add questions, add comments. Let's make this as interactive as possible. Arpit's like, our expert here. So any burning questions, definitely share them. But we'll get started with a little intro into who we are. So getting to know us a little bit. Arpit, I'll let you go first. Let's get a little intro, and I'd love to hear how you kind of march to the beat of your own drum.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the stellar intro. Really glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So I've been, creating data content for almost 4 years now. I don't have a background in data. Most people know that. I have a background in growth in marketing and product to an extent. So the first time I basically got to work with data at scale when I was leading growth at Integromat, now called Make.com. I realized that data is just becoming so important. This was like 5 years ago for folks working in data adjacent roles like product growth and marketing. So folks like me, but there wasn't a lot of vendor neutral educational content about data for folks like me. So that's when I really started going deeper into like creating data content, and like writing has always been a big part of my work. I truly enjoy it, and I always enjoy breaking complex topics in simple terms. So yeah, that's how I started like creating data content, and Database is like a third iteration of all of my content and community efforts. And with Database, I'm like I said earlier, I'm trying to combine my love for music and drums in particular with the work I do in data. Like really passionate about making data knowledge accessible, and that's what I'm trying to do with Databeats. So yeah, Databeats, you can think of it as a B2B media company plus a learning community, but the way I describe it is essentially the final destination for honest, accessible data content for tailored for growth practitioners and business leaders. So yeah, that's that, and yeah, I'm really excited to talk about the GDG model and all of the new stuff that we're up to.
I love it. And yeah, for those of you that can't maybe quite tell behind Arpit, he's got all of these amazing posters of different bands that he's been inspired by. So all of these, you think true creators. And Arpit and I were talking the other day, and we're like, when you think about creating, right, content and music, whatever it might be, and just the passion, the thought, the energy that goes into it, but you don't always get it right? And so that's kind of what we're here to unpack a little bit, or what are some of those tips, things to consider so that you do get it right. You have that hit single or that really awesome album, right? Like that's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. And I think, yeah, with Arpit, I also love music. I would say how I maybe march to the beat of my own drum while, you see a lot of rock bands behind Arpit. I am a elder emo at heart. So any of the punk rock music, that is my guilty pleasure. And what I, have fun doing. I love live music, and that's what I enjoy doing on weekends. So there we go. So we'll start little quick overview. I knew Arpit talked about Databeats a little bit. We'll dig a little more into what that means, what you're building, all that good stuff. And a little bit about MetaRouter. So like, why the heck are we talking about this today? Why have we joined forces to talk about data and data quality, right? So MetaRouter is a server-side tag manager at our core. But what we do is we actually remove those crazy third-party tracking tags that are cluttering your website, cluttering your marketing campaigns, making kind of a mess of your data when you could be streamlining it with a single tag server side. So we try and make people's lives easier by collecting more and better customer data so that anywhere that flows downstream, your analytics tools, your customer engagement tools, your CDPs, whatever that might be, have better, higher quality and secure data from the source from the moment it's collected. So that, along with Databeats, Arpit mentioned the GDG pyramid. I don't know if you want to give a quick overview of kind of what that is and how we'll talk about it today.
Yeah, so GDG stands for Good Data Growth. And the idea behind the GDG pyramid or the GDG model is that every organization needs to build a robust foundation for data, which is what I refer to as good data. That itself is a lot of work. The next step is to, like, once you have a robust data foundation, you can start, doing stuff on top of the data to drive insights from the data. But a lot of organizations get stuck at the insights layer, which is really just, halfway there, right?
Yeah.
The ultimate goal is to, like, drive growth using data. Otherwise, all of that investment in infrastructure and tooling is no good, right? There won't be ROI on that investment. And therefore, the GDG pyramid lays down sort of a process for organizations to go from no data to good data to insights to growth. And the path from insights to growth, basically, there are two paths, right? One is activation, where you're putting your data to use through experimentation, through campaigns, etc., which leads to better experiences, which ultimately leads to growth. And the other path is basically, once you have insights, you take good decisions based on the insights, as long as insights are based on good data. Once you take good decisions, you need to put those decisions into action, which ultimately leads to better products, which ultimately may lead to growth. So yeah, that's the like a quick gist of the GDG model, but we'll get into it more as we talk through it.
I think what really hit me there is like that weird data limbo, right? Like the importance of that foundational infrastructure. Like, don't get stuck in that limbo, because it does very much impact ROI. I think we hear that quite a bit. So I'm excited to dig into what that means, as really our goal here is to make sure people can do more with that data. So
Yes.
I love it. So like you mentioned, good data starts with good infrastructure. That's really where we come in. And so with that first point of view, or that first thing you have to think about in 2024, right, is this idea that data quality should be improved during the point of collection, right? Doing it right up front and making sure that it's not, you're not waiting till maybe a downstream tool or before it's too late to actually make sure that that data is high quality. So would love to get your thoughts on this kind of topic and burning questions that you should consider and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, data collection is typically the first step, right? It's a really important step, and it's a continuous process. It's not just a one-time activity. Now, a classic mistake is to, like, first collect all the data, store it in a centralized location, and then figure out what to do with it. But the thesis behind the GDG model is that you should only collect data when there is context, because when you have context, you will have questions. And if you have questions, you will actually know what data you need to answer those questions. And if you know what data you need to answer those questions, and questions could also be like, running campaigns or experiments, not just questions to derive insights, right? So context leads to, like, good questions. Questions help you understand what data you need to answer those questions or run those campaigns. And when you have that, then the next component, which is collaboration, becomes a lot easier, because data collection is not it is a collaborative activity, even though sometimes organizations might just leave it to the data team or the engineering team to set up collection. But ultimately, if you want to do it well, it has to be a collaborative effort between engineering, data, as well as product growth, marketing, or like whatever non-data team is, like, responsible for the collection efforts, or what like whichever team is trying to sort of use the data. So
Yeah.
I'll talk a little bit about my own experience as the head of growth at Integromat. So we were a bootstrap company. We didn't have a data team, but we were growing really fast, and we didn't have much infrastructure. So naturally, I took it upon myself to set it up, and I worked with two of our really smart software engineers to set up our entire custom data infrastructure and our product analytics and other downstream activation tools. And what I realized is that a lot of things that I would take for granted, that engineers being engineers would already know, wasn't really true, because ultimately software engineers and data engineers don't necessarily speak the same language. So I realized that like initially the engineers who were working with me, they didn't quite understand why I want all of these. And I was like really particular about what data I need. I had a really detailed tracking plan and all of that stuff. And they were like, what are you going to do with all this? How is it going to help our company? And we were all actually really passionate about the product. So the fact that they were really curious enabled me to explain to them, why I wanted data to be collected, like in a very, very detailed manner, in the sense that each event had a list of properties, and I'd also specified the data types of each property and also the destinations for each event. So once they sort of understood how all of this would help us, increase our activation rate, which is what we're trying to do at that point in time, which would ultimately, enable us to convert more customers into paying customers, more users rather into paying customers, because we had a very generous free plan, and ultimately drive growth for the company and increase revenue. So once they understood that, everything became a lot easier. They had a lot of ideas to share with me in terms of the data we were trying to collect, or sometimes I wasn't sure what data I should collect, but I had a use case in mind, and they would help me figure things out. So just the three of us, and it worked really well. And because I'm sort of obsessed with like documentation, I documented everything in as much detail as I could. And so that ultimately, like, we started collecting data, um, I would say a few months after we sort of decided to embark on this project. We did a lot of groundwork. We created the documentation. We figured out our initial use cases. In fact, we didn't even procure our activation tools until we were sort of ready to start implementing data collection. And at the time, we didn't really buy a ready-made packaged solution. We built our own, sort of microservice to collect data. So yeah, going through all of that process made things much easier, much faster, much more streamlined, as we sort of moved along that journey.
I think, I mean, some really important points there. Number one, like you said, it's like the purpose and the context of the data, right? Like, what are you collecting and why? And I think that's often overlooked. I've been in situations where it's like more data, more data, more data, and that
Yeah.
turns into kind of insanity, because once you have it, you don't know what to do with it, or how to govern all of it, or make sure it's all safe and compliant, or what are you going to use it for, and storage costs that may come
Yeah.
with that too, right? I
Yeah.
think that's a great point you bring up as well in terms of collaboration. Maybe we can dig into that a little bit more, because um, you have to, like you said, I think maybe as a marketer, I sometimes forget the difference between, data engineers, data scientists, kind of that
Yeah.
those other
Sure,
data,
which is understandable. Yeah.
which, right. And so I think, to your point, like, having those open, honest conversations and taking that curiosity and using it as like a team effort is really, really important. But I also know you mentioned in your book coming out the idea of this ownership. So yes,
Yeah.
100% collaboration is key, but we often see, I mean, any MarTech stack design that we've seen, right, is like insanity. Like, there is tools on tools on tools. It's always
Yeah.
growing. You can't just throw tools at the problem, right? So what is kind of your thought, or best practices to think about when you're assigning ownership to these tools, or making sure that there is some sort of clear ownership within that?
Yeah, absolutely. So ownership is obviously like one of the key aspects of collaboration. If no one's really owning the efforts, then people will do whatever they want to do. One of the classic problems is that marketers or growth people or product people would think. I mean, they'd buy a product because they'd invest in a SaaS tool because they think that once we have this tool, our problems will be solved. But not a lot of people think about the implementation prior to procuring the tool, right?
Sure.
So what happens is once they've bought the tool, when they start paying for it, they're in a flurry to sort of get it implemented and start using it. And because they're in a flurry and there's no planning that has happened beforehand, and no one really sort of owns it, they'll just hand it over to whoever's available, typically a data engineer, or at a smaller organization, a software engineer, to implement tracking. So if you talk about a tool like MetaRouter or any other data collection tool,
Yeah.
It'll typically be done in a silo, which doesn't make any sense, because how will a data engineer or software engineer know what data points you want to track, right? They wouldn't know how to sort of name events, or like what properties to send with each event.
Right.
And then once like whoever is responsible, they just do something. They'll just set them something up based on their own understanding, and then once the data starts flowing in, people have more questions, and then they have more requests for data, and they're like, oh, this doesn't work, we need that. And that obviously leads to more and more data and more frustration. And because there's a lack of ownership, there's obviously no good documentation. And ultimately, like, once the people who were involved, who procured the product, move on from the organization, someone else comes in. This actually happened to me. I was at someone else who joined an organization, and I was like, okay, so whom should I ask? Where is this data? Where is the tracking plan? Where is the documentation? And no one really knew, because no one
Yeah.
even knew who implemented these tools, and there were just a crazy number of events, no standard taxonomy, and it was a hot mess. So yeah, I mean, ownership is so important. And who should own the project? I think the
That's the
answer is
question.
it depends, right? In our
Yep.
case, we were a small team. I was the owner. Typically, I believe it should be someone who, like at a large organization, would be someone who sort of liaisons between the data and engineering teams, and the data adjacent teams like marketing, product, and growth on the other
Yep.
hand. So typically like a product person, like product ops person, or a data ops or a rev ops person, depending on how the organization is structured. So that person essentially becomes sort of the bridge between these two sides. But at small organizations, it could very well be just one product ops person, or just like a growth person also. It really
Yeah.
depends on the number of use cases they're trying to sort of implement. And like, I think one of the other problems is that when there is a lack of ownership, different teams, once they know these tools are available, they start throwing in their requests. And there's no one to sort of prioritize those requests. So everything becomes like an urgent requirement, and then it becomes like a really painful thing for the data and engineering people, because ultimately this is not their core work. At least for software engineers, that's not their core work. Even for data engineers, just setting up tracking is not something they sort of look forward to, right? They also want to solve problems, and they're really capable of solving a lot of interesting problems. So yeah, these are some of my thoughts on collaboration and ownership.
And I appreciate the point of view on ownership, because I think that's a question we hear all the time. Is it marketing? Is it product? Is it dev? Is it IT engine? There's so many places it can live. And so clearly outlining that, especially not just bringing a use case forward, but bringing a tool, right? If there is a use case that can't be executed and a new tool would help solve that, it's not, you can't just go ahead and invest, because you need to be mindful of, again, and that pure communication across the board about who's going to own it, when like a new request comes in, how's it get prioritized, exactly true, because that's when you'll see the value of the tools you're investing in. So I think that's
Yeah.
super important to remember. And you mentioned this prior about how both data collection and this process of collaboration is an ongoing iterative activity.
Yeah.
So we talked about, documentation 100%. So when a new use case comes up, kind of what does that look like? Let's think about this as the grow phase, right? We talked about kind of where to get started, how to collaborate, how to define that ownership. Now, how do you think about growing as new use cases come up?
Yeah, so the way I've described it in the GDG model is that
Yeah.
once you sort of have some data, and you reach like you have a strong data foundation, you can start doing two things. You can start deriving, you can start doing event analytics to derive insights about how users are using your product. Typically a B2B SaaS example, but also relevant for a lot of B2C consumer brands, right? The other thing is to like sometimes it's not enough to just look at events in a product analytics tool. You also have to, a lot of questions require one to like model the data, by combining data from different sources. So that's the other thing. And once all of that happens, there's some insight. And once you have some insight, you have more questions. That's typically a circular process. You have more questions. So
Oh, yeah.
basically that gives you more context. And then once you have more context, you want to like collect more data. So it's an ongoing process, and it is an iterative process, because it only works if it's an iterative process. Because what happens typically is that if you just collect some data today without context, or you think you might use it in the near future, so you collect it today, and then there is no immediate use case. By the time you want to start using that particular piece of data, it may not be accurate for sure. It might, your pipeline might break completely if there are like changes in the product. And we can talk a little bit about data contracts, and
Yeah.
how changes upstream affect data downstream, and all of that stuff. So it is an iterative process, involves a lot of different people. Ultimately, if you're collecting data, first party data from your own product, your software engineers are very much part of the loop, right? If they make
Right.
changes to your product, and you okay, so let's talk about an example, right? And I love this example, the Notion, a product that everyone's familiar with. It's more useful once it becomes a collaborative product. At least from Notion's point of view, they want more people to collaborate in a workspace. So let's say there's a, initially there's just one way to invite people to a Notion workspace via email, right? And that is being tracked, and a PM can see how many invites are being sent every day or every week or whatever. Now let's say the team decides to add a couple more features in terms of how people can be invited to the workspace, and they enable you to generate a link and just share it with your coworkers, or also connect your Slack workspace and directly send invites via Slack. Now these are two new features, just very small features that change the invitation flow. Now, if these features are not accounted for in your data pipeline, basically what happens is that when people start using these features, these the invites that are being sent using these new methods are not being tracked, and ultimately, because people have these new easier ways to invite people, people might stop using the email invitation flow, right? And a PM who might not be aware, or a growth person who's looking at dashboard, will be like, oh, suddenly our invites have just gone down, which is a huge problem, right? So it's a problem because no one really, like the software engineer who worked on the new feature, did not inform the data engineer who had set up that pipeline, and it's not his fault, right? No one told him, and therefore the data changed, and a PM or a growth person sees it and they get all worried, and then a fire drill starts and they start figuring
Yeah,
out the issue. So that's why the process is pretty complicated technically, but if it's well defined, it doesn't have to be, right? There are a lot of people involved, and there's always like there are lots of dependencies, right? So yeah, I mean, I mean, yeah, so that's like, you know data contracts is an interesting thing to discuss. But in our case, like at Integromat, we didn't really have this problem because we didn't have a data team. So it was just the software engineers who were doubling up as data engineers. And if you're a small team, then of course these problems are not so. You may not even face these problems, but at a
yeah,
typical organization that has a lot of teams and a lot of tools being used across the org, these issues will happen. And ultimately, this data which is being sent downstream, let's say to an email tool, right? You're triggering emails based on, let's say, if whether an invitation is being sent or not. All of
yeah.
that breaks, right? So that's why it is like an like a collaborative process, an ongoing and iterative process, and it's not natural to like try and like do it all in one go.
100%. I think that that idea of decisions being made just because the data isn't quite telling the right story is really important. Like you said, the fire drills, the attention that's taken away from, other new products that could really be driving the business forward. It's really interesting to talk about. I think I hear the word data leaks probably more than I'd like to in the conversations I have, but for good reason, right? There is a concern that if and when that happens, like how do you prevent it? How do you make sure that the data is all flowing to the right spots, and
Yeah.
that you're, like you said, making the right um, kind of decisions based on that? So you mentioned a little bit about the data modeling, right? And the importance of that. And I think about this as, so we talked about kind of the growth and the iterative process and trying new things and how to think about that. So now let's talk about this idea of maybe sustaining that a little bit, right? With things like models and event analytics. So could you talk a little bit more about what this means to you within, things that you really need to think about as you work on your data strategy in 2024?
Yeah, so I mean, data modeling is a fascinating topic. It's a really broad topic. I have
Yeah.
a chapter dedicated to it in my book. So, I mean, there are two things that I like to cover. So, when we talk about data modeling, in the context of like data workflows, we typically talk about analytical data modeling, which is taking some data from whatever source and like doing something with it to like ultimately derive insights from the data, or send like model data to a downstream destination to use that data in a campaign or an experiment. With event data is like typically more straightforward, but event data is not always enough to like answer questions. And if you talk about metrics, right, like
Yeah.
for a B2B SaaS, standard metric would be the activation rate, right? So the activation rate um, depends on how teams just describe the activation milestone. Right now, the activation milestone may or may not be just one event. It could be a series of events depending on the nature of the product. So if you're a tool like Mixpanel, a product analytics tool, your activation milestone will not just be if a user creates a report. It'll typically be user creates a report and shares it with a colleague, and someone views it x number of times over a period of 7 days. I mean, that's when you start considering that account as active, right? So data modeling, so there's obviously activation, which happens at a particular point in time. It may or may not be an event. It could be a series of events, and then there's active users or active accounts. So to like create these metrics, you need data from different sources. And that's where data modeling becomes really important. And when we talk about data modeling, we talk about application data modeling. But again, if something changes in your product, right? If something changes in the way your product operates or works, right? Like if you talk about B2B SaaS products like Notion, once again, there's always a workspace which has many users, and one user can be part of many workspaces. So there's a many-to-many relationship between users and workspaces, and that's how the application has been modeled. So that's typically the application data model. And when something changes there, everything gets impacted downstream, right? So I think it's really important for growth teams, product teams to understand, the the differences between the application data models and the analytical data models, and also the process of like creating these models and when they are like a prerequisite. Sometimes folks just want to like dream up a metric and they expect you to see it on a dashboard, in a few hours, but that's not always possible because it can be really complicated. The process of defining these relatively simple sounding metrics such as activation rate or active accounts, active users is a pretty tedious process. So yeah, I mean, all of this happens in the before the insights phase. When data is being like prepared and modeled, and ultimately, teams start driving insights. This is typically before they start activating the data or taking decisions on top of the data. So yeah, so those are some of the things about data modeling. We can go really deep into it, but yeah, I think yeah, I think this is sort of, we've already covered quite a bit.
Sure. I mean, as a marketer who has 100% requested, I just want this metric put in this dashboard, like
Yeah,
no big deal. I have a lot of sympathy now hearing this because 100%. I think you explained it actually really well to me. You were talking about how these two are really typically different workflows. So if
yeah,
you have an accurate model sitting on top of inaccurate data, then
yeah,
it's still a problem, right? So
yeah,
because they're separate workflows, but they work together, that
right.
I don't know if I want to say contradiction, but the
Yeah. That's
structure.
one thing I wanted to mention. Thanks for
Yeah,
reminding me. So, yeah, I mean, it's totally possible. Like someone has spent, like an analyst has spent a lot of effort creating model based on your request to make a metric available in a dashboard. Now, if something changes in the data, or if your data is like somehow not being collected accurately, the model is just sitting on top of the data, right?
yeah,
A good, an accurate data model, a good data model can sit on top of inaccurate data or data of like poor quality. This again, it again depends on like how the data has been collected, or even if the data was collected properly in the first place. If something breaks, if the pipeline breaks or a feature changes, things
yeah.
can go wrong, right? So the
Yep.
data models are accurate, but the underlying data might be inaccurate, and no one will really know until someone figures it out downstream, either by looking at a
Yes.
metric or by looking at a campaign that has gone awry. So
Right. Yeah, I love it. And I think, in the world of AI and machine learning, as those models become more apparent, that's something that really you're going to have to think about more and more. So I think that's really important. Um, and our last one here
yeah,
to really think about, this was kind of eye-opening for me because I do tend to use data action and activation in the same sense. So this was a really good call out that I've learned from Arpit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts just explaining, we hear, I would say the word activation all the time, right? We're going to activate more data. We need an activation tool. We need to do more types of activation to get more revenue, right? So I think this distinction is really important, and I'd love to
yeah.
hear your thoughts on like, what that is and what it means.
Yeah, so the way I see it, activation and action are like two distinct activities that teams perform, right? So once you have some insights, you want to like activate the data or put the data into act. Like some people say that put that, like they refer to activation as putting the data into action, which is technically right, but the idea is to like run experiments using the data or run campaigns using the data, right? Um,
Yeah,
and when that happens, you ultimately lead to you're trying to create better experiences, right? So when you're activating data, when you're running a campaign or running an experiment, essentially you're deriving more insights, right? So using those insights, you're trying to improve your campaigns and experiments and trying to improve the the end user experience, right? Which ultimately might lead to growth. So it's one distinct path, right? The other is action, which basically means once you drive some insights. So let's say you look at your dashboards, you look at how people are using your product, and decide to like get rid of a feature because you feel like no one's really using it, or maybe it shouldn't be available on this plan, on the free plan. Maybe it should be available on the pro plan. So
Yeah.
that's a decision based on some insight that you've derived. You might have run some experiment which led to some insights which led you to take this decision, right? And then you have to put that decision into action, right? It's not enough to just make that decision or take that decision, right? So when once you put that decision into action, you ultimately try to like you're trying to create a better product, right? And ultimately that can lead to growth. So these are two distinct paths, distinct activities, typically carried out by different teams, right? Like again, going back to my experience from Integromat, I was essentially like we didn't really have a like even a dedicated product team. Our CTO was like the main PM, but I worked with him. And when I was doing when I was running experiments or campaigns, I was basically focusing on like just how to provide better experiences. Whereas when we're talking about the product, we think about how to make the product more usable, or we actually had a lot of features on the free plan, so we should remove some features on the free plan, make them
Yeah.
available on the paid plan because no one's really using these features. So those were decisions that we were taking and putting them into action, and these are two very different workflows. Ultimately, all of this together would lead to growth, right? So
Yeah. I think, and especially in a world where I feel like I hear about product-led growth, that type of stuff more and more, this becomes even exponentially more important to think about. And like you said, because it often is two different teams, having that conversation, I think is really important as well.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so thank you for pulling this out. Yeah,
I love it.
so yeah, this is essentially what I refer to as the antithesis to the GDG model, right? So
Yeah.
if you start collecting data um, as is, without any context, without collaboration, just because you think you need all of this data. The process is typically lengthy. The data collection process is lengthy. That's why a lot of vendors claim that, hey, it takes 6 months to implement a CDP or whatever. So it's not a straightforward process. It's squishes and it leads to some data, which may or may not be good data. If you're lucky, you might land with like a good process and a good data, but it's highly unlikely, right? And then once you start deriving insights, your insights might be based on data that isn't necessarily good, right? So your decisions might be suboptimal, or your experiments are unreliable, which ultimately leads to like poor experiences and worse products. And of course, everyone is frustrated. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I've shared this with a lot of people, and a lot of people agree that this is the case, right? There's obviously a lot of frustration when things don't work. Everyone is frustrated. Folks who sort of buy the products, or like give the approval to buy certain products, folks who implement the products, and folks who ultimately use those products. And by products I'm talking about like tools, right? Like data collection tools, activation tools, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's really important to like avoid frustration, and that's why the GDG pyramid lays down this process, which I think companies of all sizes can benefit. It's not just for large companies. For if you're a smaller company, you may have like lesser use cases. You might be able to skip some of these components or steps, which is totally fine.
Yeah.
The idea is to like give people a sort of a
Or,
model that of
yeah.
yeah, I don't like the word framework, but a model
Sure.
that they can adapt. Yeah, that they can adapt to their own needs and workflows and stuff. So
Yeah, I think that we need, it's like a t-shirt right here, like avoid the data frustration. Let's have the right model to think about it so that we don't get to that point where we're, seeing inaccurate results, experience, product changes, and no one wants to go back to the drawing board because all of those things take time, right?
yeah.
So let's recap. I know we're running a little over, and I want to make sure we have time for any other questions that people may have here on the live chat. So to recap a little bit, we're looking at the 5 things that we talked about. I'll make sure everyone has these as well, and why you
Okay.
need to think about this in 2024 when you're coming up with your data strategy. Everything Arpit mentioned is hugely important, things you need to consider so that you are setting yourself up for success. And so, of course, one of the things we do at MetaRouter is really that. So we want to make sure that you have reliable, clean, accurate data up front. So the moment you collect that data, we do all of that in transit in real time so that when it gets to your other downstream vendors, like Arpit said, your analytics, your CDPs, your, customer engagement platforms, whatever that might be,
Exactly.
is ready to go. So we are quality obsessed. We even have multiple customers that talk about, implementing us as that foundation before those other tools for that exact reason. So very eloquently said, Arpit. Thank you so much for everything you've shared today. We have a little treat for those of you joining us with Arpit's book that's coming out, Good Data to Growth, with 30% off with the Take 30 code. So I don't know if you want to, give a little overview or teaser, maybe what we didn't cover today that's in your book of, why people should check it out. I have to say I did a pre-read and it was fantastic.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I would like to mention one thing about MetaRouter that I really appreciate before I get into this is that MetaRouter also enables you to enforce your consent. I think that's a huge problem that MetaRouter is solving because a lot of companies, we didn't talk about consent, but, consent is obviously important from a privacy perspective. And, a lot of people will be like, okay, we have a consent management platform or a tool and we're collecting consent and that's enough. But enforcing it, making sure that the consent is being synced with all your downstream tools is a really important activity. And I think MetaRouter, the fact that MetaRouter is focused on that is a big win. So in terms of the book, well, I just finished the second to last penultimate chapter today. It's 5 chapters. Some chapters are pretty dense, but ultimately each chapter goes into a really important topic. It's mainly I would say designed for folks who are working in product growth roles, typically at B2B SaaS companies or like consumer companies. I mean, it's already available as a work in progress book. A bunch of people have bought it. Folks who buy it can ask me questions, and I'll start. I start working on the editing process soon. So the book it'll still take a while for the book to be out like a physical book, but the digital version is already there, and a lot of people are already sort of deriving value from it. So do check it out. You can check out the intro, which is freely available. And if you have any questions, you can like reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Love it. Yeah, as I think 2 fellow data obsessed people here, I hope you all took some really good insights away from today. And please, obviously, reach out to us. I feel like Arpit, you and I could talk about this all day. And maybe we do a follow up based on consent enforcement because, like you said, that's critically important in this whole process. So, open to any questions. We'll stick on for a couple more minutes, and if not, thank you all for joining us and enjoy your day. So you and I can hang on a little bit.
Yes, for sure. This was fun.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, everything we hear every day, right? It's good to finally, talk it out a little bit. I think this is a really good model to think about it too.
Yeah, a lot of these things are top of mind for me, especially, a lot of the topics that are perceived to be very technical in nature, like data modeling or semantic layer or data contracts. These are all important concepts for, everyone to understand, everyone who works with data, essentially. And that's actually what I'm trying to do with my book. And ultimately, I also intend to like create other forms of content to like make these topics more digestible. I'm pretty happy with like, the fact that I took the time to like go into these topics, because these are things that I've been wanting to talk about, write about for a long time, but I didn't really, get the chance to. So it's been a gratifying experience, and the timing is great for this conversation. Because
So you're gonna be the John Lennon, the Freddie Mercury of the data world, and I am so here for it. And I feel like we have to start a proper band at some point. We're gonna go on tour and talk about data during the day and play some music at night. So that's
that's the dream. That's the dream. Yeah. Maybe someday.
Any good data horror stories that you've seen, like cautionary tales worth sharing?
Yeah, I mean, again, based on my experience, like one of the companies I worked at, there was, all the tools were there, but nobody inside the organization knew who owned the tools, and it was a really frustrating experience for me because I was like hungry to like drive growth, and I was like, hey, give me the tools, and okay, where is the documentation, like I said, and no one really knew, and that was almost an eye opener because before that experience, I didn't even know such things happen, that people would spend like thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on these really expensive tools. And the tools are great. And ultimately what happens is people end up blaming the tools, right?
Yes.
Which is obviously unfair, because if no one really wants to use the tools properly and document things, then it's an organizational problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a problem with the team dynamics. It's not a technology problem. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that was like an eye opener for me, and that sort of pushed me to again like talk about these things that I would otherwise not really talk about or write about.
Yeah, I love it. And then if there's a model that everyone can understand and think about and be mindful of, I think that's where kind of those bridges happen
Yeah.
throughout the process. So I love it. Okay, so it
Cool.
sounds like we're pretty quiet on the chat today, but with that all being said, Arpit, thank you again so much. This
Yeah.
was really fantastic, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Yeah, absolutely. If people have questions, like I said, they can always reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to answer questions about any of these things. Yeah.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you
Thank you.
shortly. Thanks.
Have a great day.